In Advent's past, I am sure that the frequent expressions of hope that we had, there we go. I don't know. I remember Advent's past, people would talk about, well, I hope for world peace. I hope for economic security for everybody. I hope for food for the hungry. I suspect that our expressions of hope this Advent are more focused on the situation we find ourselves in. We hope for the day when we can hug our loved ones again, grandparents, grandchildren, dear friends. We hope for the day when those who are dear to us, we hope that they will not contract this virus. We are all hoping right now, I think, that the vaccines will prove to be as effective as they're suggested to be, and that the inoculations will begin soon. And I think we hope that by this time next year, we'll be able to gather together without our masks and to sing aloud the songs of the season. We hope. Among the letters of the New Testament are two written by Peter. And in the first letter, Peter reminds the believers, whom he describes as Christians who are scattered exiles, he reminds them of their hope. And I want to focus on this verse on this first Sunday of Advent. Peter says to these Christians and to us today, therefore, with minds that are alert and fully sober, set your hope on the grace to be brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealed at his coming. And that verse sums up so much about what Advent is about. We hope because of Christ's first coming, the grace that we have experienced in Christ, but we also hope because we anticipate and we watch and we wait again for Christ to come. The term that is translated in our English Bibles here as alert is actually a verb that describes physical preparation. It originates from a common practice in the ancient Near East when people would gather up that long outer garment that they wore and they would tuck it in to prepare for physical action. So when a farmer would go out to the fields, he would tuck in his cloak. Soldiers going off to battle or runners would gird up their clothing to race without any impediment. And actually, John uses the very same term in his gospel. In his account of when the resurrected Jesus appears to the disciples by the Sea of Galilee, Peter and the others are fishing, but as soon as they recognize, as soon as they recognize Jesus calling them to the shore, John says that Peter wrapped his outer garment around him and jumped into the water. When Peter saw the resurrected Jesus on the shores of Galilee, he immediately wraps up his outer garment and takes action. And several decades later, when Peter invites his fellow followers of Jesus to take the same action toward the hope that they and we have in the grace brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealed at his coming. You know, when you start talking about hope, for a lot of people, hope is kind of the grown-up version of wishing. So sometimes when people have hope that is a little bit unreal, we may say to them, well, you know, that's just wishful thinking. But Christian hope is not wishful thinking. Christian hope is an expectant leap forward. Christian hope is hope that is taking action. Christian hope is about living in motion. In the NIV 1984 version, which actually my Bible that I use most of the time is one of the original NIV translations, the beginning of 1 Peter actually reads this way as opposed to what it does in the newer NIVs. Prepare your minds for action. And in the Message, Eugene Peterson has a similar translation of the opening words. Peter says, so roll up your sleeves. Christian hope is about preparing our minds for action. Christian hope is about rolling up our sleeves and getting to work. It's the sort of hope that makes us ready and willing to get our hands dirty. It's the hope that causes us to work long and hard towards our expectation, towards our promise. Christian hope is shaped by resilience and fortitude, but it's profoundly counterintuitive to the picture of hope that is transmitted by our culture. Sometimes people just sit and hope, and they just hope. But Christian hope does something. Christian hope, when it sees suffering, it just doesn't sit and hope that suffering is alleviated. It rushes towards the suffering and the pain in our world rather than shying away from it. In his helpful little book, God and the Pandemic, N.T. Wright makes an important point about this passage in Romans chapter 8, a verse many of us are familiar with. And he makes the point that the term that is translated work here implies that the way that God works for good is actually through us, God's people. The same word that's translated here as God working, God works, is used by Paul in 1 Corinthians 16 when he talks about those who collaborate with him and the whole church as joining in the work. He uses it again in the second letter to Corinth that we have, where he sums up a previous passage in chapter 5 about God working through the apostles by saying that all of them together are God's fellow workers. And so the implication back in Romans 8:28 is that Paul is talking about God being at work. When he talks about God being at work, he's saying that God is working through people. God is working through his people. He's doing what he wants to do in the world, not all by himself, but through you and me. And you may have a footnote, if you look in your NIV, you may have a footnote that actually reflects this understanding of the word. In all things, God works together with those who love him. And the Revised Standard Version actually puts it in the main text. God works for good with those who love him. And so Wright says the encouragement and the comfort here in Romans 8 doesn't amount to some sort of stoic resignation. Well, I just hope that God works. It's a call to recognize the truth of what Paul says elsewhere, that we are called to hard work, knowing that God is at work in us. And so Christian hope doesn't wait for tomorrow to see what happens for those who are suffering, for those who are in need. Christian hope seeks opportunities to work, to do something, to bring justice to those who suffer injustice. Christian hope is not passive. It is like yeast. It makes the bread rise. Hope, true Christ-like hope, is nothing short of the most powerful catalyst for change in a world that is broken, a world that is hurting. And Christian hope is not fooled by the world's promises of comfort and ease in this life, while anxiously waiting for the other shoe to drop. Christian hope understands and settles into the struggle of human experience with strength and resolve. Christian hope is not about ignoring reality. Christian hope is not about ignoring fear, anxiety, and doubt. It's about confronting them, holding steady, clinging to peace in the midst of chaos. Through the storms of life, be they pandemics, political divisions, social unrest, or personal struggle, Christian hope is buoyed by something greater that has happened and something greater that will happen again. And this time of year, Advent, is a reminder of this. This season is less about journeying back in history as it is about journeying toward a future. Advent comes from the Latin term adventus. Adventus means arrival. It's a long and steady gaze forward while looking back at history. It's a steady gaze towards looking at what God is doing and what God will do as we look back and recognize what God has done. And the light of the story of the coming of God in Christ breaks into the darkness of our past guilt, our present pain, our future anxieties, and it points us to brighter days ahead. In Acts, the first chapter, you may recall this scene. The first followers see Christ ascending into heaven, and they're reminded as they watch that. They're reminded that this same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way you have seen him go into heaven. And that is echoed in Peter's words to his fellow believers, scattered and exiled. Set your hope on the grace to be brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealed at his coming. He will come back. And that's the promise that we celebrate. That's the promise we remember during this Advent season. And it is the bedrock of our hope as Christians. And we roll up our sleeves and we get about the work of Christian hope because Christ is coming again. We can face anything and everything with resilience and fortitude and patience because Advent reminds us of how the story ends. And that's why Paul writes, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For in this hope we are saved. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently.